She arrived covered in dust, her eyes opaque like someone who had already cried enough for an entire lifetime. No one knew her name, but one look was enough to realize. That woman carried a broken world in her chest. With 2 children by her hands and a faded suitcase with the remains of a shattered past, Julia Clark stepped for the first time on the streets of Fairhollow. No one knew she was leaving behind not just the neighboring town, but also the rubble of a marriage that had destroyed her from within. Her husband Richard had died as he had lived, in the midst of noise, chaos, emptiness. What remained for her was the dust, the rotten wood of an old house, and the hope that still resisted in her children's eyes. But it was enough, or at least it would have to be, because when you have nothing left, what remains is courage. And Julia was all courage, even though her heart still bled in silence. Fairhollow was a small town, surrounded by wheat and gossip. People observed more than they spoke, and commented more than they knew. Julia arrived without warning, like a silent storm. The house she had inherited from Richard was more ruin than home. Fallen roof, broken windows, the smell of abandonment ingrained in the walls. But she saw a future there. She worked during the day with hands raw from calluses and hope. At night, she cleaned the town's inn in exchange for coins that served for the children's milk and a few more boards. It was on one of those nights that he appeared. Thomas Walford, son of the region's largest farmer, a man of presence, but with a serene gaze. He asked her, "I haven't seen you around here before," and she only responded with a look. Julia didn't talk much. Pain had taught her to be silent. But that man, with his measured words and respectful gestures, began to rebuild something in her that the abandoned house only symbolized: the hope of a new beginning. If you're getting emotional with this story, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any chapter of these lives intertwined by pain and hope. And tell us in the comments, what theme would you like to see in the next stories? Julia's mornings began even before the sun rose. Still with eyes heavy from night work, she put water to boil and woke the children with a silent kiss on the forehead. John, at 10 years old, was already trying to pretend he was a man, helping to carry wood, taking care of Alicia while their mother hammered, sawed, and cleaned. The land in Fairhollow seemed cursed in the neighbors' eyes, but for her it was sacred ground, where the old died for the new to be born. The neighbor women whispered, the men watched from afar, and the village children pointed curiously. No one understood why a widowed woman alone insisted on rebuilding a house instead of returning to family or to a new husband. But Julia was not for sale, nor was she seeking comfort. All she wanted was a place where her children could sleep in peace. And perhaps, deep down, where her heart could also rest without fear. It was on a Saturday morning, while she was sawing a board for the new door frame, that Thomas appeared for the second time. He brought a basket with eggs, bread, and a bottle of fresh milk. He said nothing beyond a brief "good morning," and set the basket on a tree stump. She just nodded, surprised. She wasn't used to gestures of kindness that didn't charge anything in return. In the following weeks he returned. Sometimes with borrowed tools, sometimes with a simple snack, sometimes just with his presence. He would stay watching while Julia worked, sometimes offering help, other times just making conversation. They discovered they liked shared silence. They would sit under the incomplete porch, drink iced tea from recycled glass jars, and talk about simple things. The weather, the progress of the construction, the town's stories. Thomas never pressured her. And perhaps that's why she began, little by little, to open up. She told him about Richard. How he had been charming at first, how he got lost in vices, how he gambled everything. Money, dignity, family, at the bottom of glasses and bets. She spoke with lowered eyes, like someone who still felt shame for something that wasn't her fault. Thomas listened with respect and attention, without judgment. One afternoon, watching John play with a makeshift hobby horse made by Thomas, she asked, "Why did you never marry?" He was silent for a few moments. Then he told her about Eleanor, the girl he almost married. She was the daughter of a rich merchant, promised since youth. But when she learned that Thomas's father wanted him to stay on the farm and not in the big city, as she desired, Eleanor broke off the engagement. She left without looking back. Since then, he avoided commitments. The abandonment still hurt him, even after so many years. It was that day that Julia realized they both carried deep scars. They weren't just neighbors or iced tea companions. They were two survivors, finding shelter in each other. The afternoons continued with small progress. A door that held firm, a wall that rose, a shy laugh that escaped between pauses in the labor. Julia's heart, once walled up, began to allow itself to look at him with something more than gratitude. But no words were spoken. It was as if time needed to heal the wounds carefully, without haste. What they didn't know was that time also brings surprises. And one of them was riding down Fairhollows Road, bringing in his smile the kind of promise that had so often destroyed. His name was Henry Whitmore. He wore an elegant hat, boots too polished for Fairhollow's dust, and a smile sharp as a knife. He said he was just passing through, looking for land to invest in, maybe open a grocery store, maybe a small school. But his eyes didn't wander over the properties. They fixed on Julia. He appeared at the inn on a rainy night. She was cleaning glasses with the same worn cloth as always, her body tired, her thoughts far away. He offered her a drink, politely refused, and then began to talk, praising her strength, her beauty, the way she faced life with dignity. She didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to being seen as a woman, much less admired. Thomas noticed. He didn't like it. He watched from afar, from the inn's door, with clenched fists and tense jaw. He had no right over Julia, but jealousy spoke louder than reason. He tried to get closer in the following days, but she seemed distant. Henry always appeared with something, A sweet for the children, picked flowers, stories of big cities. Julia laughed, and that tore him apart inside. One afternoon, Thomas called her to talk. He said, without beating around the bush, "That man is not who he seems to be. Be careful with promises that are too beautiful." She looked at him with a coldness she had never used with him before. "And who are you to decide that? Do you think you can protect me from the entire world? I can take care of myself." It was their first fight. The pain was in both their eyes. Julia closed herself off. Thomas fell silent. Henry, attentive, got even closer. But John, the little one, didn't trust the man with shiny shoes. One night, he followed him discreetly and heard a strange conversation in the barn behind the inn. Henry was negotiating papers. He spoke about taking her house, shaping the situation, marrying if necessary. John ran to his mother, breathless, scared. Julia, suspicious, decided to wait. Days later, she saw Henry rummaging through papers inside her house, alone, as if he owned it. She confronted him. He tried to justify, stammered, spoke of love. But Julia's eyes were already open. She expelled him without hesitation. At the end of the afternoon, she walked to the Walford farm. She found Thomas near the corral, with his back turned. She called him. "I should have listened to you." He turned, and there was pain, but also tenderness in his gaze. Julia extended her hand. Thomas held it. Without words, they reconnected the broken link. There was still much to build, but also much to hope for. On the porch of the house, which now had a roof and windows, they sat at dusk. He, John, and Alicia, as if they were finally a family. If you're getting emotional with this story, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments. What kind of romance would you like to see here? Stories from ancient times or current ones, new beginnings, or impossible passions? The days that followed after Henry Whitmore's departure seemed lighter, but also quieter. Julia, even relieved, felt the need to reflect on her own feelings. She was tired of living between extremes, from pain to enchantment, from distrust to hope. She was beginning to understand that true love doesn't arrive like a storm, but like a constant breeze. And that's how Thomas remained in her life. Discreet, reliable, present. Thomas resumed his visits. There were no declarations, no grand gestures. There were small kindnesses, knowing smiles, a comfortable silence that said everything. He brought lavender seeds one afternoon, saying they warded off evil spirits and perfumed the soul. Together, they planted them under the living room window. Julia's children, now more confident, saw him as a friend. John followed him through the field, curious about the farm's tasks. Alicia called him Mr. Walford with smiles. Julia just smiled, a smile full of things she didn't say. On a Sunday afternoon, during apple harvest in Thomas's orchard, He handed Julia a basket full of them and said, "Each of these apples ripened in its own time. None were rushed. Like us too." She smiled, and this time her eyes smiled too. Time seemed finally to be playing in their favor. But not everything in Fair Hollow was poetry. The Walford family, upon discovering the closeness between Thomas and the Clark widow, reacted with coldness. Thomas's mother, haughty and traditional, called him for a rigid conversation. "You are the heir to all this. A woman marked by scandals cannot be by your side. She has 2 children, Thomas. Think of your reputation, of the family name." Thomas remained silent. Then he said, "I prefer to live a simple life with someone who looks at me with truth than maintain appearances between empty walls. You always taught me about honor. Well, that's what I'm doing. Honoring what is just." The words caused a shock, but he didn't back down. He couldn't anymore. Meanwhile, Julia was rebuilding her house. New tiles covered the roof. Flowers grew under the windows. The neighbors began to change their gaze. Now they saw strength in her, not scandal. The town, little by little, accepted her presence. The inn offered her a position of trust. She began coordinating cleaning and training new employees. Her name, once whispered, was now spoken with respect. On a calm night, under the wooden porch, Thomas took courage. "Julia, can I tell you a dream I've had for some time?" She looked curious. He continued, "I dream of a house where we wake up together, with the smell of coffee and children laughing. With silence sometimes, yes, because I know you need it. But our silence." Julia felt a lump in her throat. She said nothing. She just held his hand. It was the answer he needed. The next morning, Thomas brought more wood to build a small shed in the back of the house, something that would serve for the children's toys and also as Julia's workshop, who now began sewing for others. The clothes made by her simple hands became desired throughout the region. Fair Hollow finally surrendered to the talent and delicacy of that woman who had once arrived covered in dust. But fate still held surprises. During a fair in the neighboring town, while Julia sold her clothes and Thomas negotiated seeds, a man approached the stand. He was young, had clear eyes and the appearance of someone well-born. He stopped in front of the clothes, looked at Julia and said, "Are you Mrs. Julia Clark?" She nodded. "I am Eleanor's nephew." Thomas, hearing the name, became tense. Julia looked at him, confused. "She is very ill," the young man continued, "and asked me to find Mr. Walford. She wants to apologize. She says she has carried guilt since that day. She was never happy." Silence fell over them like a heavy fog. Julia noticed the confusion in Thomas's eyes. It was as if an echo from the past had returned to test the present. "Will you see her?" she asked with a firm but gentle voice. Thomas hesitated. Then he answered, "I will. I need to close this chapter." But I'm only going because I know exactly where my heart is now." In that instant she knew. He wouldn't leave her, and indeed he returned 2 days later. He brought a dried rose and an envelope. Beautiful words. Too late. But they made me realize how liberating truth is. She hugged him, for the first time without fear. Time in Fair Hollow seemed to have its own rhythm. The seasons changed with an almost imperceptible delicacy, and the bond between Julia and Thomas followed the same pace. Slow but deeply transformative. After the visit to Eleanor's bedside, Thomas returned lighter. Not because the past had been erased, but because finally it had been forgiven. Not by her but by himself. Julia received him with warm tea and attentive eyes. The children ran to meet him like someone reuniting with an old friend. That afternoon was different. There was something in the air, as if life was about to change tone. For the first time, Thomas entered the house without hesitation, taking off his hat and leaving it on the porch chair, as if to say, "This is also my place." Alicia showed him an illustrated storybook, and John challenged him to a chess game with improvised pieces. They all laughed together when the boys' knight defeated Thomas's king in 3 moves. The following weeks were marked by work and small joys. The shed in the back of the house took shape, and the afternoons were filled with children's laughter, the sound of hammers, and whispered conversations between boards and flowers. Thomas began teaching John to ride horses, while Alicia gifted him with drawings she made herself. Julia, observing everything, felt she had rediscovered something she thought was lost forever: peace. Sometimes she would sit on the porch steps with coffee in hand and just watch. The silence, once deafening, now seemed like a song to her. But Fair Hollow, with all its sweetness, was also made of people who didn't forget. On an autumn Saturday, a note was left at Julia's door. Without a name, just words written in anger. "You will never be a Walford. Go away." Thomas read the note, crumpled it, and burned it in the fireplace. Julia, for her part, fell silent. Not from fear but by decision. She was no longer the woman who fled. Now she was the woman who faced things. The next day, she walked to the local church and asked to help in the community kitchen. She got involved with other women in the town, helped with food baskets, and sewed blankets for poor families. The town, little by little, surrendered to her generosity. Even the grocery store owner, who once looked at her with suspicion, began saving better fruit for her children. One afternoon, Julia and Thomas were surprised by a group of school children who brought wildflowers and a colorful poster. "Thank you, Mrs. Julia, for taking care of all of us," she cried, and Thomas just held her hand in silence. Love many times revealed itself in small gestures, and there, in the middle of the dirt street, was the purest of declarations. Thomas, proud, just watched her flourish. One night, in the middle of a dance at the Harvest Festival, he invited her to spin among lanterns and dry leaves. For the first time they danced under the town's gaze. And there, in front of everyone, he touched her face and said, "If I had to choose between everything I own and you, Julia, I would choose you 1,000 times." She, without fleeing, responded, "And I would choose to be chosen, only this time by someone who knows how to love." It was the first time both said without fear what their eyes had been screaming for months. And it was also when Fair Hollow understood that there was no point in resisting that love, because it was made of the same material that sustained the town itself: persistence and tenderness. That same night, under the porch light, Thomas asked her to marry him. He didn't kneel. He just looked into her eyes and said, "Do you want to share with me the silence of mornings and the noise of difficult days?" Julia, with firm tears, responded, "I do. Because finally, I know I won't be alone." The news spread. There were those who criticized, of course, but there were also those who were moved. Even Thomas's mother, with her hardness softened by the months, sent a family brooch and a note. "You saved my son. Take care of him." The following week, as they left the church after Mass, Julia was surprised by elderly ladies offering pieces of pie, younger girls asking her for advice, and even an old blacksmith who told her, emotionally, "It's been a long time since I've seen someone look at this town with so much love. You made us remember who we are." And so, among whispers, the story of Julia Clark, the widow who arrived covered in dust, became Fair Hollow's new favorite tale. The dust had settled, but what was born there was stronger than any storm: a home. Spring came to Fair Hollow like a sweet sigh, bringing with it the perfume of magnolias and a promise of new beginnings. Julia woke early, even before the first roosters crow, and sat on the porch with a coffee mug in her hands, contemplating the landscape that now seemed to smile at her. The house was almost complete. The new windows let light enter generously, and the rooms, once damp and dark, now had life, color, and hope. But the peace that surrounded them was about to be shaken. Like thunder in an apparently clear sky, the unexpected was approaching. His name was Edward Morgan, an elegant stranger with soft speech and an easy smile, arrived in town on a gray horse and with polished leather bags. He stayed at the inn where Julia used to work and, from the first moment, didn't take his eyes off her. His interest was clear, though subtle. He passed by the house frequently, always with some excuse, seeking information about properties for sale, offering help with construction materials, or simply to greet the children. John, suspicious, avoided the man. Alicia, on the other hand, was enchanted by his compliments and exaggerated stories. Thomas watched everything from afar, with a clenched jaw and chest on fire. He had never been possessive, but there was something about Edward that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't just the way he approached Julia, but what he hid behind his exaggerated sympathy. Julia initially was cordial. She accepted some of the compliments, smiled with courtesy, but maintained a certain distance. However, the stranger's constant presence, combined with comments that began circulating around town. A refined man like that would be a good match for a young widow, they said. And Thomas, who once knew how to wait, now feared losing her. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Julia was collecting firewood near the woods, Edward approached with a bouquet of wildflowers and a bold proposal. He invited her to dinner at the new inn he claimed to be planning to open in Fairhollow. He said he saw in her a woman with vision, capable of helping him build something new, a prosperous modern life away from the bonds of the past. Julia, surprised, politely refused, but felt flattered. It wasn't every day that someone saw in her more than the widow struggling to survive. Thomas learned of the invitation even before Julia told him. Town talk. And he, without measuring words, went to her house, still with his shirt sweaty from the field, and confronted her. "What does that man want from you, Julia? Why are you listening to a stranger?" "I'm not listening. I'm just being polite," she replied, surprised by his tone. "He's not who he says he is. I know him from other times. He's been through other towns, promising gold and leaving ruins. And why didn't you say this before?" "Because I thought it wouldn't be necessary. I thought you trusted me." Thomas turned hurt. "I do trust you, Thomas. But I also trust myself. And I know how to recognize bad intentions. Then recognize them now before it's too late." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Julia's eyes burned not with anger, but with hurt. She was tired of men telling her what she should or shouldn't do. Tired of living in the shadow of others' decisions. Thomas, realizing the error in his tone, withdrew in silence, leaving her alone with her doubts. In the days that followed, Julia avoided both men. She busied herself with the house, with the children, with church tasks. But inside there was conflict. Part of her felt foolish for having smiled at Edward, for having let the past mix with the present. Another part blamed herself for having hurt Thomas, who had given her so much. The following week, during a school renovation work party, Julia received a visit from Ruth, the town librarian, a wise woman of few words. Ruth handed her an old envelope. "He left this with me years ago. He asked me to give it to the woman he would one day fight for more than for himself. I thought that day would never come. But it did." Inside there was a letter from Thomas. It wasn't recent. It had been written months before, when he still avoided the feelings that now overflowed. In the letter, he spoke about the fear of loving again, about the pain he carried in his chest since Eleanor had left, and about the woman who, unknowingly, had illuminated his darkness. "You arrived without asking for anything, just with courage and silence. But you changed everything." Julia read each word like someone drinking water after a long thirst. She knew in that instant that her heart had already made the choice long before reason tried to interfere. The next morning, she went to the inn where Edward was staying. She asked to speak with him. "In the back garden, among rose bushes," she said. "I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not looking for a new future. I'm taking care of a present that I fought hard to build." Edward tried to insist, used his smooth talk, spoke of opportunities and travels. Julia, firm, smiled with delicacy. "I am not a lady in search of rescue. I am a woman who built a house with her own hands. What I offer someone is not the promise of what will come, but the truth of what I already am." And she left, leaving the stranger among flowers that didn't belong to him. In the afternoon she sought Thomas. He was in the plantation, dirty with earth, with his hat over his eyes. Julia approached without saying anything, took off his hat, and kissed him on the forehead, then on the lips. A long kiss, with the taste of forgiveness. "Did he leave?" asked Thomas, breathless. "He never had a place here," she replied. "But you always did." Thomas smiled. He said nothing. It wasn't necessary. Summer arrived bathed in gold, warming Fairhollow's earth with its warm and lazy embrace. The fields danced to the rhythm of the wind, and the little town pulsed with life, as if awakening from a long and cold winter. It was in this setting that the story of Julia Clark and Thomas Walford would reach its conclusion. Not the end of a story, but the beginning of a possible eternity. The house was ready. The windows breathed light. The roof, new and firm, protected the dreams of that woman who had refused to be molded by abandonment. Each board, each stone, each wall raised was a silent testimony to her unshakable faith, her hidden exhaustion, and her courage to rise again even when the ground failed her. Alicia decorated the flower beds with flowers she picked from the surroundings, and John, now with a different shine in his eyes, helped Thomas on the farm during mornings. Both called him Mr. Walford in public, but in their hearts they already saw him as a lighthouse, a man who promised nothing beyond being there, always in the right way, present, firm, protective. It was on a Sunday morning, when the church bells echoed in sync with the birds singing, that Fairhollow witnessed something it hadn't seen in a long time. The union of two broken souls who, little by little, had glued themselves to each other. Without fanfare, without dresses embroidered with pearls or veils that touched the sky. Just her in a simple light dress, and him in a white shirt, washed by sun and silence. The ceremony was held in the house's garden. The pastor recited verses of hope and restoration. Thomas held Julia's hands as if he were holding time itself, and his eyes didn't seek the future. They were rooted in that moment. It was there he wanted to live. In that woman. In that house. "Behold, I make all things new," said the pastor, looking at them both with tenderness. And it was true. Everything there was new. And yet, it carried the depth of something eternal. The days that followed were not perfect, and Julia didn't expect them to be. Love born from pain is not made of heavenly promises, but of daily pacts. Thomas didn't stop being stubborn, and Julia continued wanting to do everything alone. But now there was something more. Laughter at the end of the day, eyes that sought each other during dinner, the light touch on the back when words weren't enough. One day, while tending to the chickens together, Thomas commented, with his face dirty from earth, "I never thought my life would begin at 42. Julia laughed, wiping her forehead with the hem of her apron. "And I thought I was already at the end of my road. But I think the road was just making a turn." That afternoon, while the children played by the creek, the two sat on the porch, the same porch where she had so often cried in silence, and drank iced tea. But this time the silence between them was different. It didn't hurt. There was peace. "Do you think we deserve all this?" she asked, with her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I don't know if deserving has anything to do with it. But we were faithful to what we had, to what was left. And now, look, God rebuilt what no one believed was possible." The name Julia Clark came to be respected in Fairhollow, not as a poor woman who had been saved by a farmer, but as the woman who had the courage to plant in the desert. Many widows began to seek her out, looking for advice, shelter, comfort. And she gave everything except pity. She gave strength, because that's what she had to offer. One day Ruth, the librarian, organized a small book fair in the town center. She asked each resident to write a letter about the day that changed everything. Julia hesitated. She didn't know what to say. But that night, sitting next to Thomas, with Alicia sleeping in her lap and John reading by lamplight, she wrote, "The day that changed everything wasn't the day he kissed me, nor the day the house was finished. It was the day I looked at my hands dirty with lime, with my fingers aching, and realized I was still capable of creating, of loving, of living. The day I chose to believe there was still more, even when everything said otherwise. And then love found me, without haste, without noise, like a blessing." Thomas read the letter and kissed her hand. Julia didn't need to ask if he had liked it. It was enough to look into his eyes. Time passed. The children grew up. Alicia became a teacher at the local school. John took over part of the farm. And Thomas aged beautifully. Each wrinkle on his face told a story of sacrifice, patience, faith. On an autumn afternoon years later, Julia walked through the field with a notebook in her hands. She had begun writing about her story, not to be read on the world's shelves, but so the grandchildren would know, so that one day someone would understand that true love is not the one that comes to save, but the one that arrives to build together, brick by brick, even with fear, even after the storm. At the end of the notebook she wrote, "I was a widow, I was a mother, I was almost nothing. Then I was everything. I was shelter. And I was loved. Love came late, but it came whole. And that was my daily miracle." Fairhollow changed too. The town grew a little, but maintained its essence. A land where stories were not forgotten, just passed on like whispered prayers. And the story of Julia and Thomas became one of those prayers. A real tale that mothers told their daughters, and pastors used as examples in sermons about hope and reconstruction. On the tombstone that years later would rise among the flowers of the small local cemetery, one would read, "Here rest two who loved each other like someone who cultivates the earth, with patience, with sweat, and with faith. But until then the two lived much, with tea on the porch, with children around, with silent kisses that said, 'Thank you for having waited for me.' And if you who watched until here still doubt that it's possible to start over, remember Julia. She didn't wait for destiny. She built it, one nail and one prayer at a time." Subscribe to the channel if stories like this touch your heart. Comment below. Which moment of the story moved you the most? What other stories of overcoming and love would you like to see here? Share this video with someone who needs to hear. There's still time. There's still hope. And love, even late, can still flourish. Because sometimes all we need is a house in ruins, a pair of firm hands, and someone who looks into our eyes and says, "You are not alone."